Good evening, everyone. It is Wednesday at 7 o'clock, and welcome to Spiritual Meaning Behind the Hebrew Alphabets. I'm Pastor Ed Anderson, broadcasting live from Phoenix, Arizona, and I just want to welcome you all here today as we begin, or as we continue on our journey. So, over the last several weeks, we have been taking a look at the Hebrew alphabet, and as you can see here, we've had quite a few already. So we are now, we've covered at least, let me see here, we've covered at least 17, I believe, 17 of the Hebrew alphabets. And tonight we are going to take a look at the 18th Hebrew alphabet, which is the Hebrew alphabet Tzadi. Tzadi. So what does that look like? And there it is right there. So that's Tzadi. So let's just go ahead and just launch right into this. So as you know, the pictograms on each of these Hebrew alphabets has a story, or it's a spiritual teaching that God conveyed to the Hebrews. So this is one of those ancient languages that go all the way back. It finds its roots even further than Phoenician, Assyrian. It was around that same time of the Akkadian civilization, so very, very ancient, one of the oldest languages, and the alphabets were very much like hieroglyphics, where every pictogram would convey a different meaning, and in this case it was always a spiritual meaning. So one of the interesting things is that the 22 Hebrew alphabets is actually connected to an 8-verse section found in Psalm 119, and for various poetic reasons it was put that way, but only until recently was it realized that the spiritual meaning behind the Hebrew alphabet conveyed a deeper truth beyond the words that were found in those 8 sections found in Psalm 119. So as we take a look at this 18th Hebrew alphabet Tzadi, it is attached and assigned to Psalm 119, verse 137 through 144. So let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the traditional and historical meanings behind the Tzadi. So the very first thing is that the Tzadi, the pictogram, represents a person. And this is sort of a prophetic storyline where the Hebrews and those who came in contact with the Hebrews and they knew about the Hebrew alphabet, they knew that the Tzadi, represented a person who was bent over carrying a burden. So you can see them on their knees and their arms are up and basically carrying a burden. So the Tzadi is this person who is in humility and carrying a burden for the purposes of good. So the Tzadi represents this person who symbolizes the work of God. So this is really a story that goes all the way back, even before the time of the Hebrews, when Moses was given the tables of stone. It was in the Hebrew language that God wrote. So here, this symbol symbolizes God, who would send someone to carry the burden of mankind. So that was the teaching in this alphabet, that there would come a time to expect that God would intervene in the affairs of mankind. And this person who God would send would be true, would stand for love, and would love justice and fairness. So wouldn't side towards a conservative side or a liberal side, but came for all of mankind, loving justice and equity and fairness for everybody. He would be straight. In other words, he would say it like how it is, but he would very carefully make sure that a person isn't found in a position where they're always on the defense. So God would send this person who would be fully honest with the conscience of others. In other words, would be fully aware of the complexities of that person's background and what it would take to basically win that person over, whether it's through a confrontation, saying true words, or being very compassionate and loving. Whatever that person needed, the concept of the Tzadi is that God would send this person who would be able to reach the various different complexities of humanity. Now, the Hassidic Jews called this person the Tzaddik. Okay, so Tzadi, so the person who attained spiritual mastery. Okay, so basically he's the top echelon, the master of all the rabbis, or he would be like the guru of them all. He would be like, in karate, you'd be like the 9th degree black belt. Okay, this guy would be the person who the Hassidic Jews would call the Tzaddik. In other words, the spiritual master, the person who would be able to reach all, who would carry the burdens of all mankind, and it would be for the purposes of bringing righteousness, justice, fairness, truth, being honest, and reaching people so that way they can come closer in this walk with God. Okay, so the idea here is that because the earth is broken, because the earth has fallen into this condition of sin and iniquity and wickedness, where there's this constant struggle between good and evil, the idea was that mankind cannot restore itself. Like, we can try to do it, and we can try to create laws and create ceremonies and different religious practices that would help us overcome sin, but at the end of the day, we're still fallible. So as a result of that, it would be God who would have to send the Tzaddik, or this person in humility, who would intervene on behalf of a fallen world that had no power in itself to gain victory over its issues that it's struggling with. The reason for that, of course, is because there's other forces beyond mankind. So mankind already has problems within itself, but there's other forces that are influencing it. So therefore, there had to be a balancing factor, okay, in another variable that would bring equity, so mankind can then choose equally between choices that they have to make to either be right with God or not right with God. So this is the teaching of the Tzaddik, is that as we're growing and learning more about God, there is an angle to God where there was a plan that he had created, and it was codified in this Hebrew alphabet that would teach that God would send someone who would intervene on behalf of mankind and a sinful world. Okay? Now, what's really fascinating about this one is that the pictogram of the Tzadi is a fishing hook. Now, if you look at this, you say, oh, this doesn't look like any fishing hook that I've ever seen. But let me tell you something. Okay, well, first of all, let me just tell you this. The fishing hook is a double fishing hook, okay? So it represents both righteousness and humility. So in other words, God is saying that through the concept of love and righteousness, and through the concept of humility and servanthood, that God would be able to win mankind. That it would be in that way that God would be able to bring mankind into a position where they could be made right with God. And it's the concept of the fishing hook because, again, the Tzaddik, or this person who God sends, people would have to bite. They would have to partake. They would have to bite the bait, so to speak, in order to be hooked, either through righteousness or humility. Those are the hooks. So you would fall for God. You would love God because of his righteousness, or love God because of his humility, not just his justice. Okay, and it's through that love, compassion, and righteousness that we would then bite, and then God would then bring us in. He would help us so we can swim to God, but God would then, like a fisherman, bring that fish in. And it's one person at a time. So God is interested not just in a group, but in an individual. Okay, so those would be the two hooks of the Tzaddik. And okay, so here's the thing: you look at this and you say, well, this doesn't look like any hook that I've ever seen. But if you ever been involved in fishing, for example, my family comes from Hawaii. I grew up in California. We did a lot of deep sea fishing. And when you do deep sea fishing, you use more than these one single hooks. You use what they call the double hook. And in Hawaii and Philippines, that's the only kind of hooks that they use, are the double hooks. So let's take a look at that. If you took the Tzaddik and you turned it on its side, okay, where, again, this pictogram of the Tzadi is a fishing hook, okay? So this is what they used in the Middle East. So you take the Tzadi and you just turn it a little bit on its side, and now it takes the form of a fishing hook. So this is a double fish hook where it loops down. Okay, so you have the one that bites on the one and then the one that bites on the bottom. And the concept there is that it'll be through God's righteousness and God's humility combined together that you are double hooked, and you'll be able to get God's assistance as he takes you in. And it'd be the Tzaddik or the righteous one, the perfect one, the person that God would send, who would be the one who would intervene, and this concept of the fishing hook. But it was more than that. This fishing hook concept said when you are in this growth relationship with God, when you bite the bait, so to speak, and you learn of the goodness, and that you no longer have to fight and swim against water currents, and you no longer have to struggle, that you would then share that news. So like a fishing hook, the person who achieved, so the person that God would send who achieved that perfect righteousness and humility, or the Tzaddik, okay, it wouldn't be so apparent, like a fish hook, right? When you put a fish hook out there, you just have the bait, but you don't actually see the hooks, okay? So likewise, this person would be hidden. In other words, he wouldn't come out saying, hey, I am that person, and he wouldn't be the person who would come out like a majesty or a king or whatever. He would, at first glance, appear as an ordinary person, in spite or despite their great spiritual stature. Okay, so Jesus said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And he was referring to this double hook, okay, the Tzaddik. He, okay, is telling us that if we follow him, okay, bite the bait, that he in turn would turn us into fishers, where we would take individuals and we would catch them. And this is Matthew 4:19. Capture them for what? Well, basically capture them to help them turn their way and discover a loving God and have this relationship with this loving God. So, friends, the Tzadi is a perfect symbol, a pictogram of Jesus. Humble, on the knees, carrying the burdens of the world, who would represent that double hook of humility to the cross, right, to the death, but also righteousness, perfect in all things. He was not a sinner. Okay, only Jesus can claim that. He is, according to the Hassidic Jews, I'm using their words, the Tzaddik is that perfect person that God would send to intervene on behalf of mankind, and that is Jesus Christ. Okay, Jesus is the one which the Jews were looking for, the one known as the Tzaddik. Okay, so he is that perfect, righteous, just, humble, compassionate, loving spiritual master who God sent, and it turned out to be his own son. And his whole purpose is to win us over, to seek and find those who God wants to bring back into the fold. And as we discover these things, then God says, well, God will work through us and we will become his agents. In other words, it's him who's doing the fishing, but we're the ones who God is working through. So we're agents of God. So we then become a part of that body of God, the Tzaddik, okay? In other words, that perfect righteousness and humility where we're conforming to Jesus. God is working with us for the purposes of finding others that God can bring into the fold, okay? So even this picture here where Jesus is bent over, humble, under the burden of the cross, it even looks like the Tzadi, okay, that Hebrew alphabet. Psalm 14 verse 3 tells us, because all have turned away from God, because of that, all have become corrupt. And according to the Old Testament, the conclusion is there is no one who does good, not even one. Now, if I would have not told you that this was Psalm 14:3, you would have thought I was talking about Romans, where Paul said the exact same things. The very things that we don't want to do are the things that we are inclined to do. The things that we want to do, the good things we want to do, we can't do them. So therefore, we're wretched. Oh, wretched man, who I am. Who will deliver me from this body of death? Because we don't have the propensity or the power within ourselves to do good. So therefore, thank God that he sent his son, a savior, who is able to intervene for us and bring us back into that right place with God. So that whole teaching in Romans is basically the same teaching in Psalm, which we learned in that one letter, the Tzadi, okay, where Jesus would come in humility and righteousness and carry a burden for us so that way we can become good. And in Isaiah 53:4, therefore, the conclusion is surely he. Now, who is he? So Isaiah is it's a messianic book that points to Jesus. So this is talking about Jesus Christ. Surely Jesus took up our pain and he bore our suffering. We know that. We saw when he was whipped, when he was beaten, when he was spit on, when he was cast down and whipped, when he was crucified on the cross. All of that should have belonged to us, right? But it says here in Isaiah that surely God, Jesus, took up our pain and he bore our suffering, and yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. In other words, Jesus took the punishment that we deserved because of our rebellion against God. And Jesus took the consequences of our choices. But now we have a new choice. Now, if we decide that we want to be a part of Christ in gratefulness and love and thanksgiving, we say, Lord, thank you for that, for what you've done for me. Then what do I need to do? See, that's the Tzadi. You've just been hooked by the humility, the love, the righteousness, and the compassion of Jesus. And because that you want to be a part of that, you have to be a part by communion is partaking of the bread of Jesus. The wine is the sacrifice of his blood. So you have to partake. You have to bite into the hook, and then God will then do the rest of the work where you just hang and God will bring you in, okay? Now, Psalm 55:22 tells us that Jesus will carry your burdens. Cast all your burdens on the Lord. So if you're suffering from things like health, financial crisis, or even some things in your home where there's some worry and some depression, God says you can cast all those burdens on him and he will sustain you. So you have to believe it. So if you give it to him, he will sustain you and give you the ability to meet whatever needs to happen to get you through that trial. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. In other words, if you stay solid in God, since he's already carried the burden, okay, then Jesus says that as long as you stay in the shelter of God, he will fight those battles for you and he will not permit you to be swayed either way, okay? So that's the concept of the Tzadi, because if you're hooked into Jesus, you're not going to bite anything else and no one else can get you because God controls the speed by which he's bringing you in. But you've got to stay on, you have to stay on the hook. You have to stay concentrated and in that relationship with Jesus, okay, with God. And in Psalm 68:19, he says that it is he, Jesus, who daily bears our burdens. In other words, it wasn't just when he was on the cross that one time, it wasn't a one-time event, but it is a daily bearing of our burdens. So this is why we daily go to him with our issues. Like we might be a little foggy in the brain, we might be tired, give it to the Lord. Meditate on his word. You might say, I don't know what to cook because I can't go to the grocery store, whatever. Give it to the Lord, and somehow God provides in different ways. So even the little things you can take to the Lord. All right? He daily bears our burdens. Now, knowing this, knowing that the Tzadi is symbolic of Jesus, that it is him who is the righteous and just person, the humble one, who would then take the burdens of the world. Let's now apply that spiritual meaning behind this alphabet that's been assigned to Psalm 119, verse 137 through 144. And let's take a look at what it says. So we start with verse 137. Right away, David says, you, Lord, are what? Righteous. So the very meaning of the Tzadi is, Lord, you're the righteous one. You are going to send someone who will then overtake what evil I have. It's not about me now, Lord. It's about me turning to you. It is you who are righteous, and it is your laws that are right, okay? So the righteousness of God is actually reflected, he says, in the laws of right, which is the Ten Commandments. So here we see that the law, the Decalogue, and all of God's statutes and everything he says is based on this concept that God wants you to be right with him, that he wants you to be safe, he wants you to be healthy, he wants you to be in this relationship with him where you are safe and secure from all the burdens of the world. So this is why David says in the Tzadi, okay, just like what the Tzadi is telling us, that you will send someone who will intervene. Therefore, Lord, I'm one who needs that intervention. It's your righteousness, Lord, and your laws that are right, not my laws, not my own opinions. And verse 138, the statutes, in other words, those things that are unchangeable in God's kingdom, the statutes that you have laid down. Now, there aren't many statutes, but I can tell you the Ten Commandments is statutory law because God wrote it with his own finger on tables of stone. So anyone who tells you that we're no longer bound to the Ten Commandments, like and those things in the Ten Commandments, like the Sabbath or honoring your father and mother or murder or adultery, all that, they don't know what they're talking about. They clearly did not study Psalm 119, okay? Here it says that the statutes that God has laid down is righteous. So if God's character is righteous, if God's going to send someone who's righteous, if God says that I can be right with God because of his statutes, why would we eliminate that? You see, it doesn't make any sense. And Jesus never said he did anyways, and neither did God. Look at what it says. Why? Because they are fully trustworthy. If something is fully trustworthy, it's not just trustworthy, it is fully trustworthy. You notice that adjective there, the way it describes it? It's not just a simple human trustworthiness, it is a godly, full trustworthiness that is solid, okay? So the Tzadi is this concept that Jesus is going to be the righteous one. Jesus is going to be the humble one, the just person, the spiritual master who will then come in and bring righteousness, who will make things right. And therefore, we have to have trust in Jesus. We have to have trust in God's laws, trust in God's statutes. And look at verse 31 or 39. 139 says, my zeal, it wears me out. So, it's not just my energy, my strength. It says my zeal. A person with zeal is like they have a lot of power. They can keep going and going. They have zeal until they're dead, okay? But yet David says that if you try to do it yourself, it's going to wear you down because your enemies are not only going to ignore what your words are, but your words turn into actions and they will laugh at your actions. They're going to ignore your actions because you have no power, okay? So then he goes on and he says in verse 140, therefore, your promises have been thoroughly tested. So this is the thing that God tells us. Don't just claim God's promises and say, okay, it is what it is, and I'm going to claim it, and then you let it go. God says that you can actually test it. So your promises have been thoroughly tested. How are they tested? So look at your life and look at all the times that some impossible things happen, where some events occurred that were completely outside of your control. Okay, you need to write those down because that's God coming in and he's fulfilling a promise to you. And you may not have even known it. But as soon as you go back and you start to see how God is thoroughly testing his promises through you, okay, the end result of that is you, who's the receiver of those promises, will thoroughly love God. So your servant loves them. He loves the fulfilled promises. He loves the fact that you are the receiver of all that righteousness and goodness and justice by God. In spite of the fact that you didn't deserve it, he still came in and intervened for you. And then look at verse 141. Though I am lowly and despised. So in other words, there is no respect of persons with God. Doesn't matter if you're rich. Doesn't matter if you're a king, a queen, if you own all these amazing things. Clearly, God says, even if you are the most lowly and despised of all people, that means that you must be a drunk. You must be in prison. You must be on death row. You are so lowly and you are so despised by others that they spit on you. They hate you. Okay, they look at you and sneer at you. And here David says, is even though you are in that bottom rung of all society, if you do not forget God's precepts, if you don't forget God, if you remember God and his goodness, if you remember that there's hope for you and that there's a promise in spite of yourself. Look at verse 142. He says, God's righteousness will be everlasting and it will be applied to you in spite of your lowliness and in how people think of yourself. More importantly, or think of you, but how you think of yourself. So in spite of what people say to you or what they say about you or what you say about yourself or what you think about yourself, it's still God's righteousness that is everlasting and it applies to even the lowly and despised. Why? Because God's law is based on truth. It's based on justice and equity. It's based on the fact that he knows that you don't have the power within yourself to overcome all the struggles you're going through. So because he knows that you're weak, he says, don't worry about it. Just latch onto me. Remember that bait? Hook onto me. So hook onto me and he will bring you in. Where your weakness fails, God's strength picks up and it will prevail. Oh, that sounds good. So where your strength fails, where your where your strength fails, God's strength prevails. Okay, so that's a really good line there. Now he concludes in verse 143 and 144. He says, "Trouble and distress have come upon me." Okay, so right, this is the concept of the Tzadi. The Tzadi says is, even though we're in this relationship with God and we're growing and we found justification, we found atonement, we found intercession, we're still in this condition where we don't have the propensities towards good. We still struggle with that. Paul said the very things that we want to avoid, we can't help ourselves. We keep on doing those things. And the very things that we say, I want to do the good, but I don't have the power in me to do it. So God then says, I will send someone who will be the intervener, okay, the Tzaddik, the spiritual master, and all you have to do is latch onto him and his righteousness, his equity, his fairness, his justice, his compassion, his love will be imputed onto you. So in verse 144, he says, your statutes are always righteous, okay? So what statutes are we talking about? Because oftentimes when we talk about God's commandments and God's statutes, clearly, he's talking about this promise of the Tzadi. He's basically saying that because you taught me this spiritual message, because this is the meaning behind the Tzadi, that is like a promise, a statute, a command, a decree, a precept that God has given. And it's based on righteousness, and it will always be righteous. And even to this day, people still use the Tzadi in Hebrew language. It's standing there right in front of us. This is the letter that symbolizes Jesus. And notice what it says here. As soon as we accept Jesus and we understand what he is about and understand why he came, then it says that I might live. So where I was headed toward death, as soon as I latch on to Jesus, I now have life. Now, does that sound anything vaguely, remotely familiar to you? Where you were headed to death and all of a sudden you believed and found Jesus and now you have life? That's exactly John 3:16. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So let's take a look at what we learn now in Psalm 119 through the lens of the Tzadi. First of all, Jesus is the righteous one. Jesus' laws of love are right. Jesus' laws of love are true. Jesus' statutes of love are righteous. Jesus' laws are everlasting, and Jesus' righteousness will lead us to eternal life. Now, even if you didn't know Hebrew, let's say, for example, you didn't have the opportunity to watch what you're watching right now, you didn't study Hebrew, you still knew this truth because of what you read in the New Testament. But isn't it awesome that what you see in the Old Testament was already taught in the Old Testament in the book of Psalms, and it was even deeper in the language that they used to write the actual letters, okay, to give these messages. And in this case, it was the Hebrew alphabet known as the Tzadi. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. John 3:16. This is absolutely the message of the Tzadi. Jesus is what the Hassidic Jews call the Tzaddik. This is the one that they were waiting for, the one that they're still waiting for. They just missed him. Okay? Jesus in his perfect righteousness, Jesus in his justice and equity and compassion and love. He came not to condemn the world, but those who see him, his righteousness, and his humility. If you take of that, if you partake and you believe, then God will carry your burdens and he will draw you to him, and he will be the one who will cleanse you. He will be the one who will conform you to his righteousness. He will be the one who will impute upon you all the things necessary to stand before God the Father. Okay? Now, amazing, right? This is the Tzadi. Take a look at it. This even looks like Jesus now. When you look at that, he's carrying the cross, he's on his knees, and he's doing that for you. That's just awesome. The righteous person, the just person that the Tzadi teaches about is actually the symbol of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we have taken a look and taken a journey on all the Hebrew alphabets, everything from Aleph, and we have continued on even through the through all of these up through the the mem, and then we looked at the pay and the ein, and today we have taken a look at the Tzadi. Now, next week when we get back together, we are going to continue on our journey. We're going to look at the 19th Hebrew alphabet. So today we looked at the 18th one, the Tzadi. There are only 22, so we're coming near to the end of this, okay? Next week, we're going to take a look at this awesome symbol known as the kuf. Okay, this is the 19th symbol. Now, if you look at the one that's right above it, okay, is the kaf, which is the left hand of Jesus, or the left hand of compassion. The one right below it is the kuf. So they sound exactly the same, but they look, and actually it looks very similar, because if you look at the kaf and you look at the kuf, okay, they look very similar, except the one on the bottom, okay, which is the kuf, it has an extra nun attached to it, okay? So basically this is a combination of the kuf, okay, and the vav. Okay, so we're going to take a look at what this actually means next week. But until then, I want to just say Toda Rabah to everybody, which means God bless. And if you can't join me for the rest of the broadcast throughout the week, I'll see you next week. Okay, until then, Toda Rabah and God bless everyone.